Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Quick Pivot, How Charter Schools Are Adapting in the Pandemic. What do researchers say? My name is Marty West, and I'm on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I also edit the publication EducationNext, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be able to moderate this panel. We have a great set of panelists lined up for you. The first will be Bree Dusseault. She is the practitioner in residence at the University of Washington Center on Reinventing Public Education, where she's been supporting the center's ongoing analysis of district and charter responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. She previously served as the executive director of Green Dot Public Schools in Washington and as an executive director for PK to 12 schools in the Seattle Public Schools. So has deep experience in both the charter and traditional public sectors. Next, we have Ashley Libetti, who is an associate partner at Bellwether Education's policy and evaluation practice area. She has been at Bellwether since 2013, and before that worked at the U.S. Department of Education and in the Baltimore City Public Schools, among other settings. And finally, we have Mike Petrilli, who is the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. He's a research fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution, and I'm happy to say that he is one of our executive editors at EducationNext. So I'm excited to be here. This is my first Palooza of any kind, and I'm particularly excited to be here to talk about this topic of how charters have been responding in the pandemic. This is something that I became curious about when we conducted this year's EducationNext survey, an annual survey that this year we did in the month of May, when virtually all schools in the United States had closed their doors. We asked families a bunch of questions about their experiences, and I think found a fairly dismal picture overall. 71% of parents reported that their child was learning less due to the closures, and they reported generally low levels of whole class and individual contact with teachers. But in a variety of areas, charter schools really stood out. For example, 61% of charter parents reported that their child was having one-on-one contact at least once a week with their teacher, compared to just 37% of district parents. So the intensity of the remote instruction program seemed to be greater in the charter sector. And that translated into differences in what parents thought was happening with their child. So just 15% of charter parents reported that their child was learning a lot less due to the closures, compared to twice that, 30% of district parents. And 45% of parents in charter schools said that they were very satisfied with their school's response to the pandemic, compared to 26% of district parents. And so a variety of indicators suggested that charters were succeeding in pivoting at least more quickly than their counterparts in the traditional public sector. And may just be me, but that was not obvious to me in advance. Yes, charters have greater flexibility that might be an asset when responding to new circumstances, but they also have far less in the way of resources than large districts do, and they have far less in the way of economies of scale to confront some of the organizational challenges associated with pivoting in the pandemic. So I'm eager for this conversation as a means of following up on those survey findings. I'm curious about what explains these differences that parents picked up on and we were able to document in our survey, whether those differences in experiences across sectors have continued into the current year, and what implications those differences have for policy going forward. So those are some of the questions I'm hoping to have answered by the end of our hour together. And we're going to give each of our panelists about 5 minutes to present some of the research that they've been involved with that sheds light on those questions. And we'll follow that up with a little cross-panel conversation and then open it up to the audience to join in. So Bree, will you kick things off for us?
Sure thing. Thanks so much, Marty. It is great to be here with you all. And hopefully you can see the slides that I'm sharing. If there is an arrow to the right that's not closed, you'll want to close that so you can see the slide at full screen. and I will be able to navigate us through this. But again, it's great to be here. I'm going to go through some summary of slides of research we've done. I'll focus more on the what. I'm really excited in the discussion to get more into the why and the how and the questions that Marty poses. But essentially, I work at the Center on Reinventing Public Education, though almost all my experience has been on the ground as a teacher, principal, and different forms of leadership in the district and charter sector. But from a research standpoint, SERPI, where I work, began studying charters and districts the week of March 16, when all of the schools closed down. And on a weekly basis, we've been tracking the behaviors of charters and districts across the country, a small sample. We also have a representative sample database, which I'll mention, that we worked on in partnership with Public Impact to look at trends that are representative of the country for both charters and districts. Almost everything that I'm going to be showing you, all of the charts, are coming from a smaller sample. It is not a representative sample, but we basically tracked about 100 districts and about 18 charter management organizations, and we picked the ones you've probably heard of. They're larger districts and larger charter management organizations. So that's going to be who we're kind of presenting research on today. And what we did is we looked at anything publicly available, district websites, social media channels, general media. In some cases, we were able to do some interviews with some district and charter leaders, but most of this is based on what we were able to glean as a kind of public consumer. So just to start off, this is actually just a description from the spring. As Marty was mentioning, there seemed to be more satisfaction. Charters in general, or CMOs, definitely provided more comprehensive learning plans quicker than districts did. So you can see that by April, just weeks after the pandemic started and schools closed, almost half of the CMOs we looked at were providing curriculum, instruction, and progress monitoring remotely. And by May, about 4/5 were in place. In terms of this nationally representative charter and district data, a project we did that looked at charter schools and districts across the country, hundreds and hundreds of charters and districts across the country, what we did see from the spring was that in general, charter schools were more likely than districts to set clearer expectations for their staff and their teachers. And those expectations were focused on things like providing synchronous or live instruction, checking in regularly, as Marty mentioned, checking and monitoring attendance, and just working to prioritize engagement with students. What we did find was that there is actually pretty similar results between how districts and charters were communicating their distribution of devices and internet access. And actually charters on this national sample actually just shared less information publicly about how they are supporting their students with disabilities. It doesn't mean the support wasn't there, but it just means that there's less information publicly available about what that looks like. Moving back into just some of the behaviors that we saw, moving into summer now. What we did see is that charters, fewer charters shared information about whether they were offering summer school. One reason why that could be is that because so many of them did set up online and virtual learning programs so quickly that they may not have felt the need to provide summer school with the same urgency as districts who took longer to shore those up. And generally what we saw for those who did provide summer school was that they were providing traditional summer school programs. We were curious to see if any of the providers were actually looking to pilot new strategies that would prepare them for fall remote learning. But really we just saw a lot of credit recovery and focused on typical summer school needs like any other year. This data is actually hot off the press. We just pulled data this week and we'll be releasing it in the next week or so. So I wanted to share some data from this fall that just gives you a sense of what charters and CMOs are doing right now. And again, this is really just for the CMOs that we've looked at. So for those CMOs, what we saw was that in the fall, that CMOs really did start the year in September with a stronger preference for remote learning. So 15 of the 16 that provided data on this are actually we're starting the year in remote, and that was a little higher percent than the large urban districts we looked at. However, by November, or literally by last week, the majority of the CMOs that we looked like had moved to some version of in-person learning. And so on the graph, that would be anything except the dark gray box. And so what you see is that charters are starting to move to more some version of in-person, be it a hybrid schedule or phasing in certain grade levels of students. And so that is, I think, a kind of interesting trend. Districts are also making that move. We do think that that's kind of bottoming out right now, given the uptick in virus counts. So we'll see if it continues. I thought this was interesting too. We looked at what kinds of remote options were available to students. And what we saw was that for the CMOs that we studied, they all offer a similar strategy, which is a school-based remote program. Districts do offer more options, but some of them are offering virtual academies. Some of them are actually saying that students need to live stream in while others are in person. And then some are giving some combination of those things. But charters seem to be very focused on what we saw them doing in the spring, which is really saying you will be taught by your child's teacher or a teacher from their school, and it's rooted in the school. In terms of intervention strategies that we see CMOs talking about, they are more likely to provide multiple strategies instead of just one. Districts were more likely to be providing small group instruction. And so what we see is that CMOs are providing a lot of small group instruction, a lot of tutoring, and extended time, and some combination. And in terms of just assessing learning loss and diagnosing students, really it's about the same. 4/5 of districts and CMOs that we reviewed do have a plan in place for assessing learning loss, which we know is a critical factor of closing gaps. And so you'll see that about half of the CMOs, which is the gray, they plan to monitor students' progress during the year, or they explain what that looks like. And that another 5 or so are doing that plus diagnosing students at the start of the year. Again, there may be more CMOs doing this, but this is just those that communicated this information to us. A couple examples of networks we've seen, and these are actually some that we were able to do interviews with. Learn, which is based out of Illinois, has a really family-centered approach, and they immediately initiated crisis response with families and have been providing a lot of food and also even financial support to families and socio-emotional support. And they've been putting families at the center of a lot of the decisions that they're making. Achievement First worked really quickly to redefine teacher roles and responsibilities and thoughtfully reassign teachers to different types of purposes to make sure that online learning took place quickly this spring. Success Academy is another example of a network that's done that and has been pretty public about that. And then Green Dot Public Schools in California, which is unionized, worked with their union to develop lesson plan templates that helped provide guidance and expectations. And they launched lessons and other materials online by mid-April. So in terms of just closing this out, and I think we'll get into some of this in the dialogue, there's no question that right now students are impacted by being in some version of remote learning. We started to see the research coming out just from the spring saying that students have lost up to a half or full year of learning just from the spring, and there are estimates as high as $14 trillion impacts on future earnings loss. So we know all this, but it just really elevates the urgency of figuring this out and the context in which we know charters and districts are working to try to get this right. And then we've just got some questions. We saw that charters really did rush to meet students and families' needs this spring. And what we're really curious about is how do charters work to innovate in the space and to use that role with their more flexible structures to meet staff's and students' needs differently, if possible or desired this fall. We're really curious about what policies may be tying hands. And given everything going on in our world, on a lot of different fronts, there are opportunities right now for charters to think about the value they provide to the public education space. And so we're very curious about how this moment might be leveraged to just influence and emphasize their impact. So I will close out there, and I'm looking forward to discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Bree. There's a ton that I would love to follow up on right away, but instead I think we're going to continue forward and let Ashley throw some additional data and evidence at us, and then we'll return to conversation later. So Ashley, over to you.
Perfect. So hi y'all, my name is Ashley Libetti. I'm an associate partner at Bellwether Education Partners. Over this past summer, I led Bellwether's work on what we called Promise in the Time of Quarantine. So this is a publication we released in September. The goal of it was to elevate and amplify some early promising practices in distance learning. We did in-depth case studies of 12 schools and systems from across the country. 9 of those were charters. So we collected information about best practices related to distance learning through kind of publicly available materials, but the best information that we collected came from our interviews with school leaders, administrators, instructional staff, as well as focus groups with teachers and other kind of instructional staff. So we did both multiple interviews and multiple focus groups with each of those schools. So our work on this project was completely separate from the work that Mike and Bree did, but our methodologies actually complement each other really well. So for each school, we identified 3 promising practices related to distance learning, and then provided really tactical information about why and how the school implemented that practice. So the work is not intended to tell schools kind of definitively what they must do to be effective. And I mean, and honestly, the most important finding from this work was that there is no, at least at this point, one right approach to distance learning. But we wanted to kind of contribute to this growing body of institutional knowledge on distance learning, so that schools looking for guidance on effectively serving students virtually would have somewhere to start. So this is a long and in-depth and very tactical and practical publication in which you can read a lot about the specific practices. But I do want to call out actually just a few that were particularly important to the success of these schools and shared across multiple, particularly those 9 charters. So first is this kind of deep and authentic investment in what I think about as engagement. So this wasn't just about measuring attendance. It was more about expanding how schools think about supporting and connecting with students and families. So one of the schools we profiled was Steel City Academy in Gary, Indiana. They started monitoring kind of right after, March 16th, human essentials for every student. That included, access to technology, but it also meant or looked at monitoring whether students and families had access to like 2 meals a day. So some of their well-being indicators. Another example is schools in the Rocket Ship Network. They created these school-level COVID-19 response teams that helped families access social services. So things like unemployment benefits, housing assistance, meals, actually similar to what Bree was just talking about, Learn in Illinois. They did similar kind of resource connection services. And then, so that was kind of, those services happened immediately in response to COVID and were somewhat reactive. But then schools actually were more proactive in evolving those supports as students' needs shifted. So all of the charters that we highlighted had some form of a homeroom. So where students had this consistent cohort of peers who they connected with every day to provide some kind of stability or normalcy. And in that homeroom, they also had a mentor teacher who provided kind of, again, this like academic support as they would in normal world, but then also more intensive social support. So schools called these different things. Kairos Academies in St. Louis called them pods. Breakthrough Public Schools called them crews. But they all had this like consistent touch point between students and schools every day, and use the data from those kind of touch points to figure out the students that needed kind of additional support based on who was absent, who expressed kind of specific like high concern needs. And then the other part of this is that schools also connected with families regularly. So that was at least weekly, if not more. And those like connection points didn't fall off as like the pandemic and quarantine wore on. One other thing that I want to call out here is the concept of how schools adapted their practices, like particularly related to instruction. So we think about this in terms of retooling and then streamlining existing assets. So schools didn't spend a bunch of money on a new LMS or other technology. I had two key examples. One is Impact Public Schools. So they created this like low-cost Google site to serve as the front door of their school. They weren't kind of content with the other options that were available, and they serve a K-2 population. And so they were able to create this Google site that was super visual. So students can log on and click their teacher's kind of face. And it had all of the links to get to their instructional content. They also did this cool like radio station. So again, it was this super low cost opportunity where students would stream it throughout the day and have their principal kind of do this pre-recorded message that would tell them when to, during their synchronous learning, move on to a new section. And then schools also adapted the work that they were already doing in order to think about how to provide instruction better in an asynchronous and virtual environment. One of my favorite examples is Uncommon Schools. So they did recorded lessons to be delivered asynchronously. And they used two existing structures to do that. First was their teacher evaluation system. So they identified their most effective teachers in each subject and had those teachers record the lessons for all students to use. And in order to kind of build teachers' new skill set related to recording lessons, they used their existing coaching structure, trained those teachers on developing lessons that would translate well in video, and kind of reiterated on them with their coaches. All they needed to do that was a recording device. So, and then one more thing about existing assets. Their existing assets also included staff. And this is actually, again, something that Achievement First did, as Bree just mentioned. So all of the charters here shifted staff responsibilities that allowed them to both keep staff employed and address new needs. So Treasure Valley Classical Academy in Idaho, they used bus drivers. They actually fixed or changed their contract or offer transportation in-house and use bus drivers to deliver meals to families, so to help with meal distribution on their previously assigned routes. So families and bus drivers already had this kind of connection. And then bus drivers served as like another communication point between families and schools. Actually, I have one more minute, so I'm going to share one more practice. And that's, I think, one of the most important ones for looking forward. And all of these schools had this shared commitment to continuous improvement. So they analyzed both qualitative and quantitative data, formally and informally, to figure out their best path forward. And then one of their advantages was being nimble enough to make those changes in response to the data in real time. I think one of the most obvious examples is instructional delivery. So there were a couple of schools, again, Impact Public Schools and then KIPP Columbus High. They incorporated additional synchronous learning time into their virtual school days after families requested it through formal surveys and then informal conversations. I'm working on a complementary but different project where we're doing interviews with charter school leaders who we talked to earlier this spring, to figure out how they've adjusted their practices using kind of a continuous improvement framework to better serve students this fall. One more plug, there is a bunch more information about what cool practices these schools are doing in the publication. You should read it. But yeah, those are a couple of high-level highlights.
Great, thank you so much, Ashley. Mike, over to you.
Okay, well, hey, everybody. Great to see you. I'm seeing a lot of familiar names over there in the list of participants. I can't figure out how to see people. I guess it's one of the downsides from not using Zoom, along with not having the touch-up feature that I really am missing right now. But I hope everyone's doing well, and I really cannot do much to build on the excellent presentations from Bree and Ashley. I will say, back in August, the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, we put out a great study by my friend and colleague, Greg Vanerick, that, like these other reports, really dug into how 8 charter school networks handled the transition to remote learning last spring. You should check out that report. It's called Schooling COVID-19, available on our site. And then there's a great excerpt in EducationNext by Greg that you should check out as well for the shorter version. And many, many of the same themes. When we wrote that report, our main focus was, well, 2 things. We wanted to get down for the historical records, or how these schools handled it last spring, thinking at the time that last spring was the main action, right? That we'd be into a new phase, maybe more back normal this year. Well, surprise, surprise, that wasn't the case. But also to share lessons that would be useful for schools in any sector, in traditional public schools, private schools, whatever, and surface many of these same practices. But maybe one thing we can talk about going forward is to the degree to which these practices really were unique to the charter sector, which ones could be replicated. The main message, one of the main messages that comes through in our report, like the others, was that these schools very quickly tried to create a sense of normalcy for their students, for their scholars. That meant trying to maintain the school schedule as much as possible. If it was 9 to 4 before they went remote, they tried to do 9 to 4 via remote school as well, which was a big difference from a lot of the traditional public schools at the time. They tried to maintain their grading routines. They say, look, we're still doing school, and we expect you to complete assignments, and we're going to grade them, and we continue to have high expectations for you. That was a big difference from many traditional public schools back in the spring. I think this fall, we did see many more of those traditional public schools sort of catch up, and certainly in their remote programming, try to make it feel as normal as possible, and did a lot of work over the summer to get teachers comfortable with that. Went back to their grading routines, went back to, having a clear sense of assignments. I also think that a big theme that came out was the importance of having a common curriculum, which most of these, or really all of these charter networks already had. And that meant that they could just really hit the ground running. Many of these curriculum resources had digital resources connected to them, so that was super helpful. But it also meant that all of the teachers in a school or across a network were working on similar lessons. It meant that, as Ashley talked about, they could select their best teacher to provide a given lesson and record that, or stream it live and have the other teachers provide support. Something that you just couldn't do if you still have a model in your school or school district where the teacher closes the door and they kind of come up with their own program. Now, I think, again, this is a case where many traditional public school districts, some have common curriculum and some don't. And the ones that do have common curriculum, especially those with digital resources connected, have been able to make the transition better. I think another charter advantage, though, that we hear, and it came up from both Bree and Ashley, is just the relationships that the schools tended to have with families and with kids. Again, not that that's not possible or doesn't happen in the district sector, it does, but it's hard at scale. That you've got these smaller schools or smaller networks, and they have invested a lot of effort into building a real sense of community, of family, with parents, with the families, with the kids. And so when the transition happened, and when the pandemic struck, and when so many kids were thrown into crisis of one sort or another, these schools were able to reach out very effectively and provide a lot of support. I remember the interviews that Greg did, and he interviewed the leaders of the networks, principals, teachers, even some parents. a theme that comes through and through is what it means if you have a high trust organization. I remember a quote from the leader of the Denver School of Science and Technology Network. And he said, look, we are a high trust organization. We've been doing this a long time. Our families trust us. And as a result, we could move quickly. We got back into entrepreneurial mode, and we got back into rolling up our sleeves and figuring things out and trying things, experimenting, see if what works, what doesn't work, pivot, quick pivot, as the title of this session says. It's really hard to do that in an environment where you don't have that kind of trust built up. And I would just argue that we've made it really hard in the traditional public school sector to build that trust because these districts have been around 100 years and so much has been built up over that time of checks and balances, of the elected school boards, of all the politics, of the unions, of the, everything we know that goes into public education just can make it very difficult to move quickly. And so when you don't have that kind of high trust environment, you just, it takes longer. You got to get stakeholders to come along with you. And that was a challenge for a lot of these schools. So I am really excited to find out from both Bree and Ashley going forward how schools are managing now. I think it's, from some of the data, I think it's interesting that not all of these charter networks have pushed to get back in person necessarily. Success Academy famously is one that has said they're staying remote for a while. I think it's a good lesson to us that this is not just about, unions or, the comfort level of what the teachers want versus what parents want that you see play out in the more political sector. It's also a matter of predictability. It's also a matter of, hey, if some of these schools saying, if we're going to stay 100% remote, and we're going to commit to that for the next 4 months, we can get really good at that. And versus the, kind of going in and out and yes or no, like you tend to see, again, given a pandemic where it's really hard to predict on the public health side. So those are some of the thoughts, and look forward to conversation.
Great. So I'm going to try and kick off a bit of conversation and encourage the panelists to pose questions of each other as well. We'll also invite anyone who's in the audience to jump in as well. I believe you can use the question and answer feature. In fact, I see a question starting up. But Mike, one of your closing comments just reminded me of something that I wanted to pose to Bree was, if I understood the data correctly, one of the things that you all picked up on when looking at charters this fall is that they're actually offering what looks like to be less in the way of choices for parents about the modality of instruction, right? That districts are often in a position where, for better or for worse, they need to offer a fully remote option, a hybrid option, maybe different models of that. Whereas the charters, if I'm reading your data correctly, they're sort of placing all their bets on one and saying, look, we need families to get on board. Is that right? Was I understanding the data correctly? What do you think explains that, and what are the advantages to doing that?
Yeah, it's a great observation and a great question. And what I'd say is charters are, or the CMO, again, just to clarify, we are looking at CMOs. We're not really looking at the mom and pops or independent schools. I think that's where Ashley's got some really great complementary information. But for these larger CMOs, they are offering a similar breakdown of modality of remote, hybrid, or in-person, or phasing into in-person. But where they are there are no options, I would say, is in what remote learning looks like. And what we know right now is no matter what mode you're in, some percentage of your students are going to be remote. That's just happening. And so, the options that we saw, we do see districts providing are school-based, which is what all of the charters are doing. They then will provide, almost all districts are also providing some kind of virtual academy, which is a different experience. It's where you're fully online. In many cases, you have to sign up for a semester or a whole year. It's kind of self-guided. It's in some cases, they're really recommending it for just a certain profile of learner, but it is an option. And in some cases, a small number of cases, we also see districts that are in person, and their remote option for students is to live stream in. So they're asking their teachers to be teaching physical students in the class while bringing in students remotely on a computer and a screen behind them. So those options we don't see charters doing quite as much. My guess is to why and the pros and cons of it. I mean, certainly a virtual academy is just a really different option. And I do think that we saw and heard from districts who are very worried about losing enrollment and wanting to stand up something over the summer to capture and keep enrollment. My guess is that charters, because I was nodding my head vigorously with a lot of Mike's analysis, it is absolutely in line with what we're seeing and what I would say as well. I think because charter schools emphasize that parent-student-teacher relationship so much that I think a lot of charters didn't maybe feel the same need to offer some kind of option like that because they were already going to be offering pretty strong school-based program no matter what. And they had been practicing and piloting those programs in the spring. Whereas going back to the data, that a number, by the end of the year, most districts had some kind of comprehensive plan, at least a slight majority, but they had not had the 2 months that charters had to work on it and get it right. And so my guess is that charters, for both operational reasons, I think just pulling off a full-time live virtual academy, just may not be feasible unless you're really large. And then my guess is that they did an assessment and they felt like the opportunity cost of putting staff and money to that was just not worth what it could be accomplished by putting that same staff and money into their school-based programs. And really a school-based program continues that relationship because it means a student is working with their teacher, they're working with their advisor. So to me, the school-based programs, I was surprised to see it, but then when I thought about it, I thought, this really represents what I think we know charters value and what they've been able to pilot during this spring.
Yeah, it's interesting. It almost makes me think about the charters thinking of the students as being students of the school and the districts thinking about them being students of the district. And that's the connection that they wanted to maintain most of all, because I could have imagined coming into this situation that, look, it's the charters that are really dependent on enrollment for their survival, and that they might have been incentivized to find, by any means necessary, how do we keep connected? It sounds like they did try to stay connected to students, but it didn't drive them in the direction of, I don't know, thinking about multiple forms of doing that.
But also, it's fascinating that, as you're all saying, the charter schools, they did not say, hey, let's try to turn ourselves into a virtual charter school because those virtual charter schools are doing such a great job, right? I mean, I think there was an assumption from these high-performing networks that the virtual charter sector has not done a very good job. Kayla Ward, hi Kayla, asked a question about whether any of these adaptations will stay after the pandemic. I wonder, I feel like there's an opening here for somebody to come up with a kind of online charter school that is very different from what we've seen from most of those virtual charter schools. That is much more traditional in a way, right? That has a teacher with a set of students that's basically doing school remotely, but that is not based on sort of the personalized learning, go through the curriculum, clicking through at your own pace kind of thing. But it is much more like school, like what these charter networks have stood up quickly. It was interesting in the spring, you had Doug Lemov out there on his blog and his colleagues, watching great teachers trying to teach via Zoom and writing up what they were doing that was working. He now, of course, has published, he and his colleagues published a great book about this. Again, they didn't look to the virtual charter schools because those virtual charter schools, were trying to do a very different model, a model that really was meant to be personalized and that really depended on students who were very self-driven and self-motivated and didn't necessarily have that same sense of community that these schools are famous for. So anyways, I hope somebody figures out how to keep this going for kids who, for one reason or another, can't or don't want to go to a physical school, but don't want to just you're sort of on your own virtual charter school feeling either.
Ashley, I wanted to follow up on the fact that you all in your study, as I understand it, looked beyond just the large CMOs and actually included quite a few standalone or mom and pop charter schools. We know that those organizations make up the majority of the charter sector as a whole. I'm curious about any differences that you may have picked up across the two types of organizations. And what, if anything, we can learn from those differences about what has been facilitating the success of charters as a whole in pivoting quickly, and what may not be facilitating that. So I guess one way to think about it is, are there big differences between the CMOs and the mom and pops as you studied their responses?
I mean, I think I'm just going to push on this question a little bit because I think it's a little bit of a false dichotomy, right? So like another good example, I mentioned this earlier, is Rocket Ship, right? So they had their COVID response teams were school level. So Rocket Ship had this structure where they like prioritized having COVID response teams, but schools created their own and decided like those supports were really tailored to what individual families like located at those schools needed. And that was actually, I think, like a pretty common strategy, right? So if a network had guidance, that would be provided at a centralized level, but then implemented based on what was school by school. Or what was needed school by school. That's actually a bit different than the larger districts that we looked at, for what it's worth calling out. And there's obviously advantages and disadvantages to those, right? One is like, if you are a larger district and you are providing, or a larger network, and you're providing guidance at scale, consistency and messaging, and like the type of guidance, you're able to give more hands-on support, but then you're also not tailoring as much. I do think, though, that when it comes to like nimbleness, the standalone schools were able to not necessarily respond better, but were able to just like use their own data to think about how they were going to respond, and get kind of like more tailored in the ways that they were thinking about shifting their practices, and they could get kind of more granular. So figuring out, like, again, like even though Impact is becoming a network at this point, it was still just one school, and so they were able to think about specifically like the hours of instructional, or like the hours and minutes of like synchronous instructional content, and they were able to do that because they were one school having parent-teacher conversations in like a super informal environment, and so it kind of goes up and down, right? At a network level, you can only provide so much tailored guidance, and you only have, there's like a limit to the level of granularity that you have in terms of data to inform that guidance.
Yeah, that's interesting. And an emerging theme actually from both Bree's response and yours is, again, the school being the unit of analysis, I guess, rather than the larger organization in the charter sector. And that's intriguing to me, even in the case of the charter management organizations. Mike, you're very generous in attributing some of the success of charters to things like relational trust among staff and students, and the existence of a coherent curriculum, maybe prior experience with technology. But aren't you leaving out the most fundamental constraint that most districts face, which is just having to deal with the unionized workforce? Mm-hmm. And is that sort of more of the story than it's been a part of this conversation so far?
Yeah, no, look, obviously that is a part of the conversation, and it is a big factor. There are counterfactuals. There was a great Washington Post story earlier this year about the Latin American Montessori bilingual charter school in DC, LAM, where they were having this huge debate with their staff about opening or not opening. And, it's not like charter schools, especially on the reopening question, they worry about the safety of their staff, and they need to. And, first of all, just because they care about their staff, but even if somehow they didn't, they also worry about being unionized. I mean, it's not there's no law that I know of anywhere that says that charter schools cannot be unionized. And so there always is that threat. And, in the early days of the pandemic, there was certainly concern that some of the national teachers unions might use this as an opportunity to try to unionize more charter schools if their staff felt like they were not being taken care of by their employers. So there is that issue out there. I mean, I do think it's part of that larger question around trust, that in especially these big districts, especially the big city districts, where there's just a 100-year now legacy of adversarial relationships, maybe not 100 years, 30 year, 40 years, but long history of adversarial relationships. That's sort of how we do it, right? That when you have labor and management bargaining over these sorts of things, even if there's decent relationships between the superintendent, the school board, the senior staff, and maybe the teachers unions, it's still about negotiating and still about kind of interests. And in the best case scenario, it just takes time. And I think we've seen in this crisis a lot of not so best case scenario where the unions have a lot of power in some places, and they've been able to just kind of put their feet down and say no to any kind of reopening, even though what we've learned is that schools can be safe places, and that not having kids in school is doing a lot of harm. So yeah, look, yes. So long story short, yes, the union issue is certainly there, but I think it's a little more complicated. And I think the charter schools know they got to look over their shoulder and always be worried about the possibility that the unions could be coming to their schools as well.
So I want to ask Bree, did you want to get in there? Sorry.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to build, if it's okay, I'd love to
Totally.
build on that, because I do think that's something we've been looking at quite a bit, which is what are these external factors that are driving differences in behavior. And I think, as Mike said, the union, they're definitely a factor. They're absolutely a factor. But we saw, and I put Green Dot on there because it is a unionized network. And by April, they were able to shore things up. My gut feel on this is that when the pandemic, when schools closed because of the pandemic, it just shone a light on wherever a district, a CMO, or a charter school was at. And districts that have strong leadership, that have established cultures of trust, and that have a more centralized curriculum and or communication system fared better in the sense that they were able to stand up programs more quickly. And we have definitely seen some district leaders and teams working really hard, even in highly unionized environments, to put whatever their values are front and center. I think one great example of that is Baltimore City, where the city really worked, even in a strong union environment, to get, I think, 5 hours of synchronous learning a day per student, because that was what mattered to them, and they really valued that. So I do think that it's in part unions, but a lot of this is about wherever a district was at. When you're in crisis, you're not going to be able to fix a lot of the things that lie in the dark. Your culture and your relationships really matter. And I'm not saying that CMOs or charters all have outstanding, perfect cultures or foundations of trust, but I do think that is a really big part of working in a charter environment. You talk about it, your culture is a part of the language and the ethos. And so I'm not too surprised to see it. And I think it's a lot more nuanced than just unions. So of course they provide that space.
Yeah, the theme of culture and trust being the sort of essential asset in this pivot also came out of a similar report from the Silicon Schools Fund, looking at which charters responded well. So I think there's certainly something to that. I want to turn to the chat, and Royce Van Tassel, who asks about a change he's seen in Utah that's intriguing, has been to move away from 5 days a week and instead to 4 days a week, with the fifth day being for supplemental work for students struggling along different dimensions. Have you all seen similar efforts elsewhere along those lines? And I'll broaden it a little bit, other just innovations in scheduling. And we can connect this also with Kayla's prior question about, what innovations or adaptations may persist beyond the pandemic. So the specific 4 days with the fifth used for supplemental work, but also other changes to scheduling.
I can kick us off real quick, and then I'll pass it over. But yes, we absolutely saw this. It actually is a really nice complement to a 2-cohort schedule where you've got students in 2 groups coming 2 days a week. What do you do with that fifth day? Districts are innovating on that. We see them using districts and CMOs, but we've really been looking at more districts. So we've been seeing them used as pull-out in-person time for targeted groups, or remote intervention time, teacher professional development or collaboration time. So I do think that is a strategy used. And then to this question of what stays into the future, I hope we've learned a lot from this, and I hope that things will change where it's productive. On the scheduling front, I think that one of the things that I would love to see played around with, especially for older students, high school students, thinking about what learning really looks like as you're thinking about college and career preparation, and thinking about, does it need to be physically in a building every day, 8 hours a day for 4 years of your life, or can we learn from this to do more flexible types of opportunities and expand what learning can look like for high school students? We see, in terms of whether that's happening or not, there's some discussion about districts trying to figure this out. I think Shelby County is thinking about doing some of this, but I don't know that we've seen it actually being piloted yet on this end.
And Mike, that's something you've thought about at the high school level, is that right?
It is, and I will put in a plug for a panel that I'm doing on Thursday here at EdPalooza that people can check out. We're going to dig into some of these questions at length about, when and where and schedules. Yeah, look, I think it's crazy that before the pandemic, we basically gave most families a choice. Either you could do some kind of full-time online virtual charter school, or your kid needed to be at school 5 days a week, for the whole school year. This hybrid approach that now, as we think the word hybrid meaning sometimes at school, sometimes at home, really wasn't very feasible in most places, maybe outside of Florida, with the Florida virtual school taking a course here or two. So I hope that is something that we consider allowing that to happen. That, imagine if you're a charter school and you say, we're going to set ourselves up like a college would, where kids go to school just Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and we're going to load them up with a ton of homework on Tuesday and Thursday, or we're going to do class from home on Tuesday and Thursday, or other kinds of schedule innovations. Try to work the schedule so kids get more sleep and can sleep in the morning, but without getting in the way of extracurriculars. I think there's a lot of ways we can play around with the schedule, and it's going to be up to you policymakers watching to give the green light to that, because there's a lot of places where still we have those seat time requirements that are very much in place. And look, there's a reason they're in place. We saw last spring what happens when you just get rid of seat time requirements. There were some schools that sort of gave up, right? And they were like, oh, well, we're just going to teach an hour or two a day. And to the question about, having this 1 day a week that's sort of for asynchronous learning. I don't know, again, just from my own personal experience in Montgomery County, Maryland, my middle schooler has that on Wednesdays, and it certainly feels like just him not going to school on Wednesdays. He just has Wednesdays off. And so I just think, there is this danger. I wish we had, again, a high trust school system everywhere, where we believed that the schools were going to take, every best use of all of that time if we let them do things differently. But again, there's that risk that it just, that the 4 day school week becomes just 4 days of school, and not actually something that is adding value.
I do
My
think, though,
middle schooler is in a private school, and that description of the 5th day resonates with me as well, Mike. Ashley.
I do think, though, that I saw a school in some of this work that was pretty intentional about this 5th day off. And instead of just kind of like wink, wink, this is doing asynchronous learning, they were really intentional about defining it or framing it as the world is difficult for students and staff, and they need breathing room for mental well-being to take a day off in the short term. I would need to go back and kind of look at whether or not they're continuing it after kind of Q1 of this fall. But there is kind of if we're thinking about things that are moving forward, or that I've heard school leaders talk about moving forward from here, it is this commitment to social emotional health and well-being of both students and teachers. And so thinking about how schedules support that priority, and how schools are incorporating that into both their vision and how they're making kind of tactical or practical decisions is, I think, something that we're seeing moving forward. The other thing I'm going to say about schedules is that so yes, seeing split schedules, Tuesday, Thursday, Monday, Wednesday. But one of the things that I've also seen school leaders do is prioritizing who gets to making decisions on who gets to go when. So based on if you're going, parent and family priorities, but also prioritizing in particular students with disabilities and young children. If we're thinking about kind of health risks and kind of who needs services the most. Schools have been super intentional, particularly the charters, particularly the standalone charters, have been really intentional about making decisions with those students in mind, giving kind of like pretty ruthlessly to say, but like the ROI there.
Well, it's interesting. New York City, of course, just announced that that's the direction that they're going in, reopening early elementary and schools for students with disabilities. I'd actually been surprised thus far that we'd seen less in the way of that prioritization in the large districts than you might have expected, given the clear patterns. Bree, I don't know if your data speak to that.
Yeah, actually, most districts that we see are prioritizing younger K-1 up through elementary students with disabilities, and especially high needs disabilities, and in some cases English language learners. So that does seem to be a trend. Like what you see New York doing feels pretty reminiscent of what other districts are doing.
All right, we only have a few short minutes left. I want to return to something that you said at the end of your presentation, Bree, which was that there may be an opportunity to redefine the value proposition for the charter sector. I want to sort of encourage you to elaborate on that a bit, help us understand what you mean by it, but also how would we go about doing it? And assuming we were able to redefine the value proposition, what is the ask? What should charter proponents be for? There's a question in the chat. What's a good starting point for policymakers to support charters? So if there's an opportunity to redefine the value proposition, sort of where are we headed from a policy perspective?
Yes, and I'll try to do my best to keep it relatively brief. It's a big question, but yeah, I think, I'm a former charter operator. I've also worked in districts. I think we've seen charters ebb and flow, how they're perceived, their kind of political standing, and what we are seeing is that despite a lot of pushback against charters on some levels of politics and even funding, charters are the set of schools that really came in and delivered more quickly, and that is what charters were designed to do. They're designed to be more flexible and to come in and to try things out. They're also designed to be hubs to pilot innovation. And so I think if there was a push I would give, a gentle, loving push I would give to the sector as a former operator, knowing how challenging all this is to be thinking about, okay, so we have really been able to replicate what the traditional learning experience looks like in the last 6 months. And I'm sure there are little pockets of innovation happening, but what we aren't seeing is, I would love to see charters pushing on some of these questions to say, what could be changed long-term? How do we leverage this moment to take some systems that are inherently inequitable, that are not working, and to redesign them and to see if it works differently? And the caveat I would put there is Mike's original point of normalcy. I think that families want some level of normalcy, so you got to figure out how to innovate within a space that's still comfortable for students and families. But I do think that that's possible. And getting to your question of the value proposition of charters, I think charters are trying to figure out what their value proposition is right now, and providing examples and pilots that are replicable or perceived to be replicable was an original intent of charters. And I think that is something that still exists. The last thing I would say is that charters, they really do, in my experience, and I think our research bears this out, really do work to build deep relationships with families. And we know that we're in a point in time where we're looking at who has control, who has power, who has the right to be making decisions in larger systems. We don't see parents and students sitting at the table alongside special interest groups as much in the district setting. And I think charters have an opportunity to show and model what that can look like, because they don't have to deal with special interest groups in exactly the same way.
I want to ask Ashley and Mike to follow up on that same basic question. What is the moment of opportunity here for charters, and how can they capitalize on it?
I'm gonna plus one Bree's point about innovation and also call out the role that authorizers have to play there. Charters can only innovate in so much as the policy environment's conducive to do so. And there's a role for authorizers both to like rethink accountability frameworks, but also kind of like there's like an ideological shift or a split here, but like think about the support and collaboration opportunity there. The other thing that I will say is that charters did a good job in this environment, like playing more of a custodial role in students and families' well-being, often without the resources to do so. And districts did it as well, but this was kind of built into charters' DNA. And so thinking about what that means from a policymaker perspective, both resources and expectations, what is not necessarily defining that role as a must-have, but thinking about how you support charters given reality, doing that, given that they may have to.
And Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. And again, thanks everybody for the great panel. I think we are just about out of time here. Yeah, look, I think that there's always been some frustration within the charter sector among some that the highest performing charters are in many ways very traditional. And as Bree said, that the parents, education's always been a very conservative thing, right? We parents are nervous about trying anything that seems too out of bounds with our own kids. And so, and what charter schools have often done is they have perfected a model that has been around for a long time. I think after this pandemic, we see new opportunities to try some new things, and that maybe parents, we've kind of opened the Overton window a little bit in terms of what parents are comfortable with, and let's see some entrepreneurs take advantage of that.
Great. Well, I think if the sector is going to capitalize on this moment, it needs, yes, to innovate, but also it needs people documenting how they've succeeded thus far. And so I think it's a credit to all of you that you've been helping write that first draft of history for us in real time over these past few months. So thanks to all of you for a great session. Thanks to those of you in the audience who joined us. And we will wish you a good rest of the conference.